Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's jump straight into this sweeping geopolitical theory presented in our source material today. The analysis argues that a massive, earth-shattering global realignment is occurring right before our eyes, reportedly over a span of just 7 days. It's a fascinating look at how international power dynamics might be fundamentally changing from the ground up, and we're going to break down exactly how the source claims this whole thing is unfolding.
To help us logically map out this dense foreign policy breakdown, we're taking a quick global tour across 6 key areas. A shifting global order, the US-China dynamic, realigning the Middle East, Indo-Pacific security, the fracturing of NATO, and finally, values versus transactional alliances.
Section 1. A shifting global order. Let's get right into the central thesis behind this massive realignment.
For decades, pretty much from 1945 up until around 2016, the world operated on the liberal international order. It was basically a system built firmly on shared democratic values and ideological alliances. But the source frames our current reality as a radical shift away from that post-WW2 system. We are reportedly moving toward what they call a multipolar transactional order. And this new era? It's highly pragmatic. It's built almost entirely on deals, mutual respect, and shared strategic interests. The source argues that nations are now acting much more like hard-nosed business partners than ideological siblings.
Section 2. The US-China dynamic. Let's actually see how this transactional order functions in the real world, starting with the historic Beijing summit. According to the source, this summit completely ditched the usual ideological posturing. Instead, it was defined by real, tangible commitments aimed at locking in structural stability. Just look at the details. China agreed to buy 200 Boeing aircraft. In exchange, there was a massive reversal on chip bans, meaning Nvidia H200 AI chips were approved for major Chinese tech firms. On top of that, the U.S. secured promises for China to purchase American oil, which specifically lessens Beijing's reliance on Iran. All of this was wrapped up in a new 3-year strategic stability framework, with Xi Jinping scheduled to visit the U.S. on September 24th. It is, quite literally, a pure transactional exchange of economic and strategic leverage.
Section 3. Realigning the Middle East. Moving over from Asia, our source analyzes a rapidly shifting security architecture in the Gulf, driven by these exact same transactional principles.
Now, the source maps out a highly specific and honestly pretty tense timeline here. Initially, the U.S. was reportedly scheduled to launch a major, large-scale attack on Iran on a Tuesday. But within just a 24-hour window, everything changed. The U.S. received urgent calls from the leaders of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, all practically demanding a pause to give negotiations a chance. And in that exact same period, unprecedented covert attacks were launched by Saudi Arabia and the UAE directly against Iran. According to the analysis, that planned U.S. strike was halted directly because of these trust-based interventions from Gulf leaders. They use their own leverage because they're prioritizing regional negotiations over an all-out U.S.-led conflict.
And that brings us to a foundational concept in this theory: the Abraham Accords. The analysis defines this as the embryonic architecture of a totally new regional superpower bloc. It's built partly on a shared Abrahamic lineage, sure, but the real glue here is a shared strategic interest to contain Iran and attract Western investment. The source actually calls this alliance the new sheriff in town. It's this fascinating arrangement where modernizing, innovation-driven economies in the Gulf, along with Israel, are realizing they have more in common economically than they do as historical adversaries. They are choosing to lean on economic and military leverage instead of pure ideological alignment.
So what is the actual result of all that leverage? Well, Iranian President Pezeshkian recently came out and stated, "Dialogue is not surrender." Now, the analysis points out that Iranian presidents just don't make public statements like that unless they have serious internal authorization. When you pair that with what the source describes as a Pakistani-brokered 14-point peace proposal operating quietly in the background, this quote suggests a genuine diplomatic window has opened up. Essentially, the heavy-handed leverage from the Gulf states forced a pragmatic space for dialogue. All of this really illustrates a broader theme highlighted by the source: systemic independence. And the analysis draws a super interesting parallel here to everyday individuals. Just as nations in the Middle East and Asia are desperately seeking independence from old, decaying global orders, everyday people are apparently exploring similar self-reliant models. The source mentions things like hidden economy, lifestyle businesses that reportedly take under 30 minutes a day to run. The connection is pretty clear. Whether you're a sovereign nation figuring out foreign policy or just a private citizen managing your personal economics, the massive trend right now is about forging independent, completely self-reliant paths.
All right, Section 4.
Indo-Pacific security partnerships. Let's head east and see how this transactional model is building into a powerful new military coalition.
9 trillion yen. That is Japan's absolute powerhouse of a defense budget for fiscal year 2026, under Prime Minister Sana Takayoshi. The source points out that this totally shatters their previous pacifist ceilings. I mean, Japan is actively lifting bans on lethal arms exports, and they're deploying counterstrike missiles aimed squarely at Beijing and Pyongyang. They are stepping up to the plate for regional defense in a massive, unprecedented, and highly practical way.
And it's not just Japan acting alone. India recently landed a landmark $428 million U.S. defense package, absolutely loaded with Apache helicopters and M777 howitzers. But here is the core transactional detail that really matters. India accepted this massive package without any demands from the U.S. to take sides in the Iran conflict or to give up its own strategic autonomy. The source emphasizes that this is the perfect reflection of the new transactional order. The U.S. is arming a vital ally based purely on the shared interests of managing a rising China. Period. They've completely dropped the old ideological litmus tests.
Which brings us to Section 5, the fracturing of NATO. While these highly pragmatic alliances are rising up elsewhere, the source argues that our old, values-based alliances are quietly but irreversibly fracturing.
To back this up, the source highlights a series of very specific, uncoordinated rejections by European allies regarding the Middle East. For example, Spain closed its airspace to U.S. military flights coming from the region. Italy straight up denied the U.S. permission to operate heavy bombers from its air bases. And meanwhile, Britain and France explicitly refused to participate in a proposed blockade in the Strait of Hormuz. The analysis cites these divergent actions as hard evidence of deep mutual distrust. In fact, this refusal to assist was reportedly characterized as a stain on the alliance. It seems that old assumption that NATO allies would automatically have each other's backs just because of shared values is breaking down.
As a direct result of this functional split, the source points out a fascinating shift. There is a massive 62% jump in today's European defense spending compared to the 2020 baseline. European nations are essentially operating as an independent self-defense consortium now. They are rapidly rearming. And it's not out of some warm ideological unity with the U.S., it's because they realize they can no longer simply assume unconditional U.S. backing. In this new transactional world order, Europe is waking up to the fact that it has to pay for and manage its own security.
Finally, Section 6, Values versus Transactional Alliances. So how do all these geographical threads we've been pulling at actually tie into a single overarching civilizational thesis?
Well, the source concludes that we are witnessing literally the most radical foreign policy transformation since NATO was founded. We are leaving the old order behind, that romanticized community based on shared democratic values and the cozy assumption of automatic defense. Instead, we're diving headfirst into the new order. The source describes it as a coalition of the convenient. It's a hard-nosed, multipolar system built entirely on deals, mutual respect, and concrete results. Basically, if you perform and bring actual leverage to the table, you get a seat. If you don't, you're left behind.
And that leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought from the analysis. If global stability is built entirely on transactional interests rather than deeply shared values, what happens when the money in those immediate interests run out? It's a super fascinating reinterpretation of current events by our source, and it really forces us to rethink the long-term durability of a purely transactional world order. All right, that's it for this explainer. Keep asking questions, keep analyzing the structures around you, and we'll see you next time.